Now that you're more comfortable with the service container and then Laravel facades, we can finally move on to service providers. So have a look. I'm going to go into my vendor directory. And as you know, this is where any Composer dependencies are installed. And as it turns out, the Laravel framework itself is pulled in through Composer, at least the framework portion. So anyways, if we take a look at this, we can see that the framework is divided into components. And each component includes a service provider. So here's the file system service provider. Let's pick another one. How about cache? There's the cache service provider. One more. How about validation? Yep, there's the validation service provider. And in fact, if we just look for Laravel service provider, sure enough, we see dozens of them, usually one per component. Okay, so what exactly is a service provider? Well, it's kind of what it sounds like. It provides a service to the framework. And as part of that, it may need to register keys in the service container, or it might need to trigger some functionality after the framework has been booted. So for example, let's stick with file system. Let's see what this one does. So as it turns out, any service provider can implement two methods, register and boot. The register method is for registering keys into the service container. So if we take a look at that, we are registering this key called files into the container. It is a singleton, which means there should only ever be one instance of it. And if you were to resolve it, you would receive a new instance of this class. Now, on the other hand, the boot method, and I don't think there's one in this particular case, but if there was, that method would be triggered after every single service provider in the framework has been registered. So you can think of it sort of as a loop. First, the framework loops over all of its providers, and I'll show you where those are declared. If you go into your config, app directory, and if we scroll down a ways, here it is. Here's a list of providers that will be loaded as part of the framework. And it's basically the framework itself. So if we scroll up, sure enough, there's that file system service provider that we were just looking at. So the framework is going to loop over this, and for each one, it will call a register method. So each of these providers will register itself with the framework. It'll bind something into the service container that can later be used and referenced and resolved. Next, though, once every single provider has been registered, it will then do a second pass, and it will call a boot method on the provider. So this would be your chance, again, to trigger some kind of functionality with the assurance that all of the other providers have been registered. Or in other words, if you need to trigger some functionality after the framework has been registered, this is the method you want. Okay, so let's switch back to register, though. For the file system, we are registering this key called files into the container. And that's going to resolve to a new instance of this file system class. So that means if the key is called files, we could resolve it, as you learned a couple lessons ago, by using the resolve function, and you provide the key, which is files. So if we run that, sure enough, we get an instance of file system. And actually, a quick note, you can also use the app helper function. Same thing, just an alias. So that means if I wanted to read a file, I could say app get, and then once again, just grab some file that you need to read, and there you go. You instantly have access to the file system. But now it's starting to become a little more clear, isn't it? We learned that there's also a file facade, right? So let's take a look at that. And you'll see right here, the key it returns is files. And that key was registered into the container here. All right, so now it's starting to make sense. When the file system service provider is registered, it adds a key called files that resolves to this. And further, we learned we can resolve it like this, app files. Okay, but you also learned in the last episode that a facade is simply a static interface to an underlying class or component. The getFacadeAccessor method for any facade will return the key that represents the binding in the container, which again is files. So now you know if I were to say file and I reference any method, for example get, well, that's not calling a get method on this facade, as you learned in the last episode. That's actually resolving the underlying class and then calling a public method on it, which would be this here. But now you understand how that's working. And here's what's neat. You won't always reach for this, but sometimes once or twice you might pepper it in. You can create your own facades. I'll show you. Let's scroll right back up, and this will hook back into service providers in a moment. Yet again, we will have a class called example, and we will handle the example. And all this is going to do is say it works. Next, I want to create a facade that will proxy to this class. We'll create another one here. We'll call it example facade. All right. And to make this work, we need to extend the facade class. And then finally, let's override the getFacadeAccessor method. This is going to return a key in the container. And now here's what we can also do. We'll take this in 2 steps. First, we could define it as any string we want. However, if we try to use this PHP Artisan Tinker, let's grab that example facade and then try to proxy to one of these methods on example. And we have that method handle. So if I try to run this, it's not going to work, right? We're going to get a binding resolution exception. And this is because Laravel tried to resolve this for you. It knows you're using a facade, and it knows the facade accessor has a name of example. But Laravel looked into the container, and there's nothing in there called example. So it doesn't know what to do for you. So it throws a binding resolution exception. Okay, so we could fix that by reaching for one of the existing service providers, or as it turns out, you can even create your own by saying make provider. So maybe you have a provider for your backend. Maybe you're working on a new package. You could add a service provider for that. Or if it's fairly trivial, just store it in the app service provider that's included with every install. And we see a register and a boot method, like we discussed. In our case, we want to register into the container. So this is the method we want. We'll say this app bind this key called example into the container. And if you resolve it, it's going to return a new instance of that example class. Okay, starting to make sense. We now have a key in the container. Now we can grab that key by resolving it out of the container using the resolve helper function or app. So if we say example, sure enough, we get whatever is returned here. Next, we have our facade, and our facade's accessor returns this string that represents the binding in the container. You learned all of this in the last episode. So that means we should be able to use this facade to proxy to this underlying class. And again, you're not always going to do this, so don't do it for every class. Definitely not. But there will be situations where it provides a really clean interface or an entry point for not just yourself, but potentially others who are using a package you provide or things like that. So let's give that a shot. App example facade, and we're going to proxy to this handle method. It works. And remember, in real life, there's often lots of registration that is necessary in order to instantiate the class. Sometimes you're providing configuration settings. Sometimes you need to provide API keys. So if you store that in the service container, almost like a factory, you only have to declare that information once. So you pass your API key, any settings there. You might read from your config, and you declare that instantiation entirely once. From then on, anytime you want to grab your example class with the necessary dependencies, you only have to reference the key in the container. Okay, however, if I were to remove this entirely, if a facade is simply delegating or proxying to another class, well, you could also just return the name of that class as a string. And again, this is where all of your learning from the last 2 episodes is starting to pay off. We realized that when Laravel tries to resolve something out of the container, it first checks if you have explicitly bound something with that key in the container. So remember, in this case, that key would be something like app example. So it checks, did you explicitly bind anything there? No. Next, it checks, well, is it a class? Because if it is, maybe I can construct that object for you automatically. Okay, so now if we try it one more time, it still works. And now you understand why. But just remember, if you do have a constructor that accepts maybe an API key, well, Laravel's not a mind reader. It can't pass in an API key when you haven't told it what the API key is. All it sees here is, all right, I need some variable called API key. You don't have anything bound for that, so I don't know what to do. So if you were to try it one more time, this time it's not going to work. You once again get a binding resolution exception. And that's because, one last time, Laravel could not find this key in the container. It then realized it was a class called example. It then looked at the constructor arguments, for example, and it checked, is this something I can pass in for you? Can I just build this up on the fly? Well, I don't know what this is. I can't help you. Sorry, binding resolution exception. So those are the situations, again, when you would want to be explicit. Bind to the service container, and you can use a string, or again, you can use that class path. It's still a string at the end of the day. And then have that return whatever is necessary. Now we filled in the missing piece. So if we try it one more time, it works yet again. All right, so I'm going to finish up with this. I fully expect this to still feel confusing. Or in other words, if I had to guess what the biggest roadblock for newcomers is, I would say it's probably related to the service container and service providers. Even the term service provider can feel confusing and fancy and over your head. It's not that complicated, but it does take a little bit of time. So if you finish up with this and you're still confused, you don't quite know when you'd reach for it, that's totally okay. At this point, my only goal is for you to understand the basics of what's going on here. So with that done, in the next episode, let's switch back to something a bit more friendly. We'll talk about mail.